Okay, so just move that way. So yeah, anyway, thanks for coming to this and for registering for this talk. As I say, it's going to be about an hour. And what I'm going to be talking about, so the talk itself is aimed at those who are sort of first-time users of eConsent, or people who are looking to use eConsent to begin with. My name is Matt Hammond. I'm Deputy Director of the Norwich Clinical Trials Unit. We're a UKCRC registered CTU in the east of England. And we've been using eConsent in various different guises for a few years. This talk itself is part of a larger project, so you'll notice that there were 3 talks when you registered. I really recommend signing up to those other. Certainly the second one should be really useful for people who are looking to start using eConsent, specifically within REDCap, because it answers a lot of the questions and the complexities that you might need to sort out. And that's going to be presented by a couple of colleagues of mine, Anthony Collis and Claire West, who are on the call today. That's the same time next week, and then there's another one the week after, which is a workshop where you can sort of bring any kind of issues you're having or any questions. This could be a bit more interactive, that third one as well. So really recommend you attending those other 2 as well, if you can. The other thing to note is that this whole project is it's a small piece of work which the NHR have paid for to do, specifically to do with developing guidance in implementing eConsent within REDCap and other similar EDC systems. And at the end of it, we'll also be producing a guidance document in the next sort of month or so, which we'll be able to send out, and it'll be on our website, and we'll also distribute it through things like UKTMN and UKCRC and that kind of thing. Anyway, I better get going. So who this talk is aimed at, as I said, it's for first-time users of eConsent, so things like people like trial managers, data managers, and early career researchers. What I am going to cover, hopefully in the next hour or slightly shorter, is what eConsent actually is, because it's not necessarily obvious, and some people get it a little bit muddled up with remote consent. It's not exactly the same thing. I'm going to talk about what the current guidance is for using eConsent. There's a couple of really good documents that are out which talk about what you need to do and what rules you need to follow when you're using eConsent. We talk about e-signatures because they're a fundamental part of eConsent. It's how you document the consent. I'll talk about the different types of those, which ones you should use in different situations. And then I'm going to do a bit of a sales pitch and talk about why I think you should use eConsent for your study if you're not already using it. I'm sure that you're probably halfway to being convinced already if you're attending today. And then finally, I'm going to talk about just bring up some questions about what you need to think about when you're going to use eConsent, things you need to consider. Because it's very good, but there are certain things you need to think about if and when you're implementing it. What I'm not going to talk about is actually implementing in REDCap. Whilst the project is about that, this first talk is mainly about just what the current guidance is and some of the terminology that's used. So it's very sort of general introduction, this one. Next week, Anthony and Claire will be talking about how you actually do it within the REDCap eConsent framework, and the week after as well. So what is eConsent? Well, very usefully, very helpfully, the MHRA have got a definition of eConsent, and that is the use of any electronic media to convey information related to the study and to seek and or document informed consent via an electronic device such as a smartphone, tablet, or computer. So the main thing here is that there's sort of 2 things really main on this slide when it talks about eConsent. It's using electronic media to present the information to the patient for them to consent, and it's using an electronic system to document the consent itself. So eConsent is 2 parts really. One thing to note, as I sort of mentioned already, is eConsent is not the same as remote consent. You can still do eConsent on site. It can happen in the hospital, it can happen in a GP practice like you would usually have consent undertaken. It doesn't mean that it's always done in a patient's home. So it's not the same. And likewise, remote consent doesn't necessarily have to use e-consent. So it's not quite the same thing. It's a very useful tool, get remote consent, but it's not the same as remote consent. The other thing to note is there's not one model for e-consent. As I said, you can do it entirely remotely, so the patient never even goes into a hospital. They just do it all online. They're given the information online. They read that information. They have a conversation remotely. They sign the form electronically, so it can be done that way. Or alternatively, it can just be done to enhance or supplement sort of the more traditional methods of consent. Or it can be something in between, or it can be a hybrid. Lots of different models of e-consent, which I'm going to talk about in the next 45 minutes or so. And the model that you choose just needs to be determined by an assessment of the risks of the study that you're doing and the population you're wishing to consent. So basically, horses for courses, you kind of want to just make the model of e-consent fit your trial, rather than having an idea of what it is and just trying to apply it, because it's always going to be slightly different. So when I talked about e-consent, I talked about these two different phases. The first being providing the information to the patient, informing and educating them on the trial itself, and the second part being the actual documentation of the consent from the participant. Often when people talk about e-consent, they focus on the latter, and they don't really think about the former in terms of the way that you can provide information. And so what makes e-consent e-consent? With the first part of it, when you're providing them the information, it's specifically you can use video, you can use infographics, you can use audios, web pages, graphics, podcasts, use all sorts of different medias to convey the information on the study to your participants, which you can't do with traditional forms of consent. Another quality of e-consent in that first part of informed consent is that it's really configurable to the participant. You can much more target it at the population that you're looking to provide the information to. You can target towards their information needs, the way that they actually are much easier for them to take on information, things like that. Other thing that is specific to e-consent is that that information can be delivered by a tablet that either you supply yourself or a smartphone that you supply through the trial, or alternatively, the participant they can access it through their own device, either their own phone or their own computer or whatever at home. So that's something specific to e-consent. Another thing about e-consent is that information that you're providing to them, be it a PDF of a patient information sheet or a video, can be centrally controlled. So you can control that at your CTU or wherever you're doing that information, and that brings a lot of advantages. So it's not the same as if you're doing a trial with multi-center trial with 50-odd different sites, each of which has got an investigator site file with dusty old copies of patient information sheets, and every time you want to change one, you have to send it out to them and all that kind of thing. You can do all of this centrally with e-consent. You can switch it across immediately. And the final thing in terms of that information delivery to patients that you get in e-consent, you can do something called a knowledge review. And this is, for want of a better word, this is kind of like a test. You can kind of test your participants on their understanding of the trial. You have to be a little bit careful with this because you don't want to come across as condescending, or you don't want to exclude participants from taking part in trials because you haven't given them proper information. But when you think of it, when we traditionally have brought patients onto trials, we've given the information, they've had a chat perhaps with the investigator, but we don't really know whether they've understood what the risks and the benefits of the trial are or what they're going to be asked to do. And that's problematic for two reasons. One, in that, more seriously, is that's not true informed consent if they don't really understand what they're signing up to. And the second part is, if they don't like the trial, if they've misunderstood something, they'll pull out of the trial, so you'll get dropouts. So this is this knowledge review step, which you can put in. We haven't historically done that because it's complicated in terms of ethically and everything like that. But a lot of industry do this knowledge review step, where you actually sort of almost check that the participant is understanding the information that you're giving. It does bring a lot of advantages in that situation. So then the second part of consent, which is the way you actually capture it, which is sort of the traditional getting a consent form and getting them to sign it, part of e-consent. The unique things about that is that you are capturing that via an electronic consent form, not surprisingly, and that you use things called electronic signatures. whilst it's slightly different to normal consent, one thing that does apply is that everything that you do, everything that's given to the patient, every document that is patient-facing or videos or websites, they need to go to ethics. They need to be approved by the ethics committee. And actually, they're increasingly becoming used to reviewing this kind of thing. So it's not necessarily news to them. So I'm going to get cracking now because this is the largest section. This is the current guidance on the use of e-consent. And what is really helpful is that about 4 years ago, the MHRA and HRA brought out this document quite presciently ahead of pandemic, as more and more investigators and sponsors were looking to use e-consent, and there was a sort of a lack of guidance around it. The MHRA and HRA got together and created this document, which is a really, really useful and easy to read and handy document. If you don't take anything else out of today, take out that you go and download this document after and read it, because it's, as I say, it's only 11 pages long. It's really clear. It was originally written with CTIMPs in mind, and in terms of sort of the e-consent process for CTIMPs, but it can be applied to all other research as well, and it does cover other research of it briefly. And what it did is it provided a legal and ethical sort of framework and requirements for seeking and documenting e-consent. It also talked about electronic signatures and gave different classifications and guidance on the use of those. So what did it say? So for CTIMPs with e-consent, it's slightly more stricter than other forms of research, which is not necessarily a surprise. And there's an additional step. And this additional step is that when you're using e-consent for CTIMPs, there needs to be some kind of discussion in real time, a two-way conversation between the participant and the investigator or a member of the team who's been delegated at the site. And that needs to happen. It can either happen in person or it can happen virtually. So it can happen, what would normally happen with the CTIMP is the patient would go into the trial, they'd have a chat with the investigator, they'd discuss the trial, they'd be able to ask questions, having been given the patient information sheet already. This still needs to happen even when you're using e-consent. So you can use Microsoft Teams, or I don't know, actually Attend Anywhere, or I think it's Attend Anytime or Attend Anywhere. That was being used by the NHS. I don't think they're necessarily using that anymore, but whatever the system is that they're using now, you need to make sure that that has happened. Either the patient goes in and has that conversation, or they have that conversation virtually, and that needs to be documented. So that's an additional step that you need to do for CTIMPs. During that conversation, during that two-way chat, the patient needs to be informed on the nature, significance, implications and risks of the trial in person. So you can't just give them an information sheet or tell them to watch a video. You have to have that chat for that, so they can make a decision. And the other thing that the interview gives you is in a way to confirm the participant's identity. So for example, you were doing e-consent and you were also doing remote consent. You need some process to confirm the patient is who they say they are, and that video can be used to do that. So it's just an additional step that you need to put in place for CTIMPs. Once you've had that discussion and it's been documented, you still need to capture, for CTIMPs, you still need to capture informed consent in writing. However, the definition of in writing allows electronic consent. That still counts as in writing. Once you've done that, and I'll talk about e-signatures and the way that you can document it in a little bit later. Once they've gone through and they've provided their consent, there needs to be some kind of method for getting the participant a copy of their completed consent form. So, like in olden days where we used carbon copies and they would sign the consent form and the patient would get one and the investigator would get one and maybe one would go to the sponsor, there needs to be something that replicates that step. So for example, the patient could be emailed a non-editable PDF of the signed consent form, which will be dated and will have their signature on. And then a copy can go to the site as well. If you're obviously emailing them, you need to make sure that you remember to put in that you're going to be capturing their email address, because it could be it's obviously identifiable information. So that you need to think about the step of getting them their consent form. Alternatively, you could print it and they could be given it there. And then the final thing as well, we'd already do this without realizing it, the participant needs to be given a contact point for further information about the trial. So that could be within the patient information sheet, the electronic patient information sheet that you provide them. Alternatively, it could be in another document that's gone to ethics, but they need to have some way of contacting the either the local investigator or the CI or the trials unit about the trial. So that's just one final step, but we do that anyway, to be honest. I'm sure that you probably do that without realizing. So for non-CTIMPs, for everything else, it's pretty much the same, but what it doesn't do is it doesn't require the need for a two-way interview. So that conversation, that virtual conversation or in-person conversation, is not necessarily a requirement for other forms of research. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't necessarily do it, because obviously some non-CTIMPs can be higher risk than some CTIMPs. For example, a surgical trial is a non-CTIMP, doesn't mean that it's not dangerous and risky and has potentially high burden for the participant. So everything needs to be done on a risk-based manner. You need to do a risk assessment if you're going to use e-consent before you implement it and try and work out the most appropriate way, method of doing it. One thing to note is, unless things have changed since 9 o'clock this morning, I couldn't find a single piece of guidance relating to clinical investigations of medicinal devices, so device trials. So again, you kind of need to do that on a risk-based manner. You would sort of, for me, if anything, sort of a class 2 or above, I would treat as a CTIMP in terms of the actual rules that we were going to apply. Anything really low risk, kind of like mobile apps and that kind of thing, probably treat as a sort of another study where you don't necessarily have as high standards. But there's no specific, unless I've missed it, guidance, and it certainly doesn't cover device trials in the MHRA and HRA documents. So I'll talk about e-signatures. So I'm going to talk about e-signatures. What are e-signatures? Well, electronic signatures, obviously. And so what they're covered by is they're covered by so originally back in 2014, there was a regulation that came out called the eIDAS regulation, number 910/2014. And that was established to create a legal framework within the EU for an electronic signature. eIDAS is basically short for Electronic Identification and Trust Services. And what that document did, that legal framework did, was defined an electronic signature as being data in an electronic form which is attached or logically associated with other electronic data and which is used by the signatory to sign. Basically, this means an electronic signature. We all know that. Because of this thing called Brexit, which you may have heard of, we had to then copy basically the EU regulations over into the UK, and that was done in 2019, and it created 2 separate regulations. Well, actually, what happened was there was a document that came out, a regulation that came out called the Electronic Identification and Trust Services for Electronic Transactions Amendment, EU Exit Regulations 2019. So that basically came out and copied them across into UK law. And then the other thing that happened was it amended a previously existing regulation in the UK, which was the Electronic Identification and Trust Services for Electronic Transactions Regulations 2016, number 696. Why am I telling you this? It's really boring. I'm telling you this just because you can then use that in your protocol when you talk about which regulations you're following. But yeah, there you go. So what are the rules governing electronic signatures? Well, there is a whole variety of things that are deemed to be electronic signatures. They can be quite rubbish ones, very simple, not very binding ones, such as tick boxes plus declarations. And what you're thinking of there is like when you buy something online or you sign up to a newsletter and you tick the boxes and then you click OK, and then you get spammed for the rest of your life. That's what that one means. Then you've got things called typewritten signatures, where you just type your name in, and that counts apparently. You've got scanned images, so scanned copies of signatures. So where someone signed something and they've scanned it, they've cropped it, and they paste that into the document. Again, not exactly best practice or foolproof, but they still count as electronic signatures. Then you've got one which is used very, very commonly. So this is an electronic representation of a handwritten signature. And what I mean by that is basically when you get a stylus pen and you sign. So pre-COVID days where you would get a package in the post and you have to sign for it on one of those screens. I guess that's not happening at the moment, but that is a very commonly used one. And I'm going to talk about that one quite a lot because that will cover most trials basically. Then you've got things like unique representation of characters, so kind of complicated passwords, digital representations of characteristics, so these are biometrics, so fingerprint scans, retina scans, face scans, etc., that kind of thing, which is obviously quite hard to fake. Then you've got cryptographic means, so really kind of complicated ones at that point. You're kind of getting into encoded devices that will then change things. As you go down the list, they get increasingly conclusive. They also get increasingly complicated and expensive. This list as well is broken up into 3 different groups. So this is in the EIDAS regulation. So you've got simple electronic signatures, advanced electronic signatures, and qualified electronic signatures. So they are broken down into simple, which basically is quite a wide range of the ones on the previous slide. So it can go from tick boxes plus declarations all the way up to, say, for example, a fingerprint scan. They're all counted as simple electronic signatures, but there's a wide range within there. Then you've got advanced electronic signatures, and what those are is they're uniquely linked to the signatory, and they allow the person who's signing to retain control. But what I mean by that is that, say, for example, a good example is the one with the scanned copy of your signature. If you've ever signed anything, someone can get your signature and they can apply your scanned signature. So you no longer have control over that. So that's what it's saying. With advanced electronic signatures, it's something where the person who's signing or the person who is giving consent or signing or whatever retains control over that. Then you've got qualified electronic signatures, and these are the really fancy ones, which are basically advanced electronic signatures, which are done with a qualified electronic signature device. So those are the kind of like really fancy little pieces of kit that you can sort of, they have to be the regulators, and basically you won't use those, so I won't go into too much detail. But they're the kind of ones where you have to enter codes, I think like your bank things, and you have to enter unique things, and then you have to scan things. Like I say, you're not really going to need to use those, because the really good news is in pretty much all cases, including in drug trials, a simple electronic signature will work. So this top group. But as I said, there's quite a big wide range within that top group, so I'll talk about that in a minute. So when you're using electronic signatures in trials to capture consent, you need to think about certain things. One thing that you need to think about in terms of which one you're going to use is the nature and the complexity of the research. So the more complicated it is, the higher risks to the participant, the more complicated and the more conclusive electronic signature you need to use. So for example, risk burdens and benefits of the research as well. And the other thing is if there are any ethical issues relating to the research, so potentially you're collecting very sensitive information, or you are, certain additional ethical requirements. You need to think about that when you think about which e-signature. And the other things that you need to think about, you need to be able to prove the following 4 things. We need to be able to demonstrate that you have some kind of control over the following things. The first thing is, can you trust and can you demonstrate that the person who's signing the e-consent form is actually who they say they are? So you need to think about that and how important that is for the piece of research that you're doing. You also need to think, can you ensure that the form hasn't been edited in any way? They haven't modified it. Obviously, when you used to give them a paper consent form, you would obviously monitor that to make sure it's the right version and everything like that, but it's very hard for them to then type up a new one and change some of the clauses. So when you're doing electronic consent, you need to make sure that the consent form hasn't been changed. The third thing as well is you need to make sure that when the form was completed, traditionally dates written on there and countersigned, etc., all that kind of thing, documented in the patient notes. In your e-consent system, you need to make sure that it has at least the same amount of date tracking and audit data in there. And then finally, you need to be able to demonstrate all of that. You need to be able to show all of that, that you have that you've put things in place for all of those things if you are audited, or heaven forbid if you're inspected by the MHRA. The good news in REDCap, I'm not going to mainly talk about REDCap, but just briefly, the bottom three of these four are pretty much covered in REDCap. The form itself isn't editable. It will capture in the audit trail, if you set it up correctly, it will capture when the form was not only signed but also accessed and for how long and that kind of thing. And all of that information could be easily exported out of REDCap. So that's the good news about using these signatures in REDCap. So in CTIMPs, there are most CTIMPs will fall into one category, but there obviously are some sort of exceptions and ones around the edges. So there are type A CTIMPs. I've never done one. And these are the drug trials which have really very, very low risks, or basically the same risks as standard care. And for those, and only require, I think, a notification to MHRA. You don't even need to get a CTA for those. For those CTIMPs, you can use really simple electronic signatures. Technically, you can use typewritten or scanned e-signatures. I wouldn't do that because I think they're rubbish, but I would still capture a signed one. But in type A CTIMPs only, you can use any type of simple electronic signature. For all other CTIMPs, so type B and C, the ones with either slightly above standard care risks or significantly above risks in standard care, plus healthy volunteer trials as well, you need to make sure that you get at least a stylus drawn or finger drawn signature. And the other thing to note is that if you're doing that, they need to be a decent quality. That's copy their signature, which they do with their hand or with their finger or with a stylus, needs to be good enough for a comparison to be made. So if the MHRA go to your site and they look at the electronic signature, they need to be able to say, right, that is clearly that patient's signature. If it's really rubbish, the thing that you're using to capture the signature, it might not be possible. I'm sort of thinking, again, in the old days where you used to have to sign for packages and things like that, sometimes the quality of those signatures was pretty bad. Likewise, if you can't really use a mouse to sign because it will look rubbish and it won't be a comparison to the original signatures. So that's one thing to note when you're doing CTIMPs and you're collecting e-signatures. For higher risk type C and B and C trials, you should maybe consider biometric signatures. This is really complicated. So these are the ones that are sort of maybe like ATIMPs or things like that, or first in man, kind of with quite strong side effects, or where patients are going to have relatively high risk. You may need to do more than just getting their sort of scanned stylus signature. And in very rare cases, you might even need to use an advanced or a qualified e-signature. In those cases, personally, I would just revert to the old-fashioned technique, because the piece of paper which has been signed, whilst it's slightly ridiculous and out of date, will cover all of that. And actually trying to set up a fingerprint scan and all that kind of thing is just going to be tricky, especially seeing as the patients can be coming in anyway for those trials. One thing, as I said already, what you shouldn't use is typewritten or scanned images of handwritten signatures, so existing signatures which are then being scanned. And the reason, as I said before, is they're completely uncontrolled. And so there's a risk that a very unscrupulous site or investigator could go through their folders, find a load of patient signatures and apply them. And the patient wouldn't know, you wouldn't know, and there'd be no control over that. So you shouldn't be using scanned copies of signatures. So in non-CTIMP, so everything else with e-signatures, Again, you can use simple electronic signatures. Where there is some risk or burden on the participant, a recommendation is that you continue to use the stylus form of signature because it allows comparison with a wet ink signature. But for very low risk studies, so we're talking like maybe observational studies, qualitative research, online surveys, questionnaires, ones where there's really very little risk and very little burden on the participant, you can usually get away with a tick box and consent statement on there, like on here, like on the image there. Again, it's something you have to run past your ethics committee. So not only do you need to send them all the documents, you need to tell them about what you're going to do in your e-consent when you're setting it up. Right, how am I doing for time? Okay, so why should you use e-consent? Right, so this is my sales pitch here. So if you're coming to this, like I say, if you're coming to this talk, you probably already want to use it anyway. But there are certain things that can really be a benefit when you're using e-consent. So I thought I'd go through those now. So when you think about it, in terms of the first part of the consent, the educating the participant, there's clear advantages of providing multiple medias in terms of getting the information into them so that they actually understand it. I mean, this talk, I could have just emailed you a PDF document and you could have read through it. Potentially that might have been better use of your time. I don't know, but there is obviously when we deliver information, we don't do it in one way. Some people will maybe have problems reading, or they will take them a long time to take on board that information. Some people take on information different ways. Yeah, there's clear advantages of being able to offer the provision of that information in multiple formats. Another thing is as well, you can be interactive. Which you can't be with just a piece of paper. So you have the interview, the discussion with the investigator, but when you're actually delivering these kind of these documents or these web pages or these interactive things, you can actually respond to the information needs of the participant better. As I said before, you can do these knowledge reviews where you actually test the participant comprehension to make sure they are actually understanding what they're signing up to with the consent. And another thing that you can do with that is you can actually use that to improve your patient information. So you can have, say, for example, patient information sheets where people query certain parts of it. So you can click on certain words and explain it. Now, if people are clicking on the same word, if all the participants are clicking on the same word, then maybe what you should just do is change your information sheet to actually explain that better. So you can bring out a new version of the information sheet. So it creates this kind of like feedback loop where you can actually get information on the information that you're giving, so you can do it better. It can reduce participant burden as well. So I mean, we've probably all done trials where a participant has done everything and then they've had to come back into hospital entirely purely just to consent, and it's such a waste of their time. It's such a big burden on them. If they could just do that from home, then obviously that brings them advantages. It can reduce the number of visits they need to attend. Likewise, if you update your trial often, sometimes you'll have to re-consent participants because the trial has changed. Well, so it saves them having to come back in potentially if they weren't going to be coming in to re-consent. You can do that remotely. The other thing, and this might just be a personal thing, but I don't keep really paperwork anymore. And when I do, I tend to lose it. And so if I was taking part in a trial, I wouldn't really want lots of bits of paper to have to keep hold of. And so if you're doing this electronically, they can keep it electronically. So it has an advantage there, I think, as well, because potentially these patients are going to be on the trial for like 10 years. So, you know, a piece of paper for that long is just a pain. The other thing, which is a big advantage for us, is that it can reduce researcher burden and also errors itself. So it massively simplifies central monitoring of consent process, because if you've got a multi-center trial, as I said, you've got lots of different versions of the document out there. If you're doing e-consent, you're controlling all that centrally, so you can version control centrally, but also you can validate the forms itself. So you can add validations to the e-consent forms itself, so you don't have to collect consent forms and check them and oh, this patient hasn't ticked here, this box, and they should have done, and all that kind of thing. Then you have to get it out and get it reconsented and all that kind of thing. You don't need to do that with e-consent because it automatically, in real time, makes sure that they're filling it in right, and it puts the right dates in and all that kind of thing. So it reduces the amount of burden there. And actually, there was this is a little bit outdated, to be fair, but with the EMA, actually the European version of the MHRA, they have inspection reports which were available. And so if you look between 2018 and 2012, so this is when most people were using traditional, or pretty much everyone was using traditional forms of paper consent, more than 1 in 10 findings, inspection findings, related to consent. And a quarter of those specifically were really silly little things like signatures not being put in the right place and date errors and all that kind of thing. And those things, if you set up your e-consent system properly, they're impossible. So you've already reduced a decent amount of the potential findings that you could get, as long as you set it up properly, that is. More reasons, and these might be a little bit vague, but actually I think the expectation of participants in trials as well. We've had anecdotal sort of evidence every now and then where patients where we've used traditional methods, and they're quite surprised by the fact that, you know, they use online methods for their banking, to buy a house, to buy a car, to book a holiday, to do all this thing. They never actually go in anywhere to sign a piece of paper. And then when they want to take part in a cutting edge piece of research, we give them a scrappy old piece of paper to sign and read, which just seems bizarre. So I think the expectation of the patients, of the participants themselves, comes into this. And actually, if you've got a well-designed, really snappy kind of e-consent system, it might give them a little bit more confidence that you know what you're doing. And the other thing is as well is increasing inclusivity to research as well, which is obviously really important. And e-consent gives you a lot of different things that you can do to work on that. And I'll go through some of those in a minute. One thing with e-consent is, though, that there's this sort of, I don't know whether it's a slightly outdated idea that e-consent can exclude certain populations, and I don't really agree with that. So one of the things that people say about e-consent is that patients who don't have internet access, it could exclude them from taking part. Well, not really, because, so firstly, internet access is basically everywhere. There's an ONF survey, and this is pre-pandemic data. 96% of all households in Great Britain had internet access. So almost every single household has internet access. 76% used internet banking. I wouldn't be surprised if that was basically 90-something% now in the last 2 years. And 87% shopped online. So most people are used to doing stuff online and have internet access. Almost everyone has internet access. And the other thing you can do is, if they don't have internet access, you can provide it to them. So we've got a trial that we do which captures a lot of data remotely. We provide the participants with 5G enabled tablets so that they can do that, and we don't need them to enter their Wi-Fi details and etc. to be able to upload that data. So you can actually, it's not crazy money. You can provide your participants, depending on how many you've got, obviously, you can loan them kit to be so they can actually do things remotely. Likewise, doesn't mean just because you're using e-consent doesn't mean you can't also have a backup plan for paper consent. So those 4% of households that don't have internet access, well, they can still be provided a piece of paper to be able to consent, or they can come and do it on site. As I say, not most, but a lot of e-consent isn't actually done in the patient's home, it's done in the hospital, so that's not an issue. The other thing as well is this perception that, you know, maybe it will exclude, I don't know, again, this is a bit of an ageist kind of statement, it's not that I agree with it, but it excludes older people or something like that, because, you know, fancy new computery things. Well, that's kind of nonsense. I mean, I speak from my dad's in his 80s. He's been using online banking for like 10 years, and you know he knows how to use everything. And I think actually that's the case when we've done, again, anecdotally from trials we've done in older populations, they don't seem to have an issue with this. And the other thing is you get additional functionality within electronic consent. So you get these accessibility settings, which you may well have used in your own browser or on your own computer. REDCap itself has an inbuilt text-to-speech functionality, so you can click on things and it will read it out to you. Well, people who have problems reading, that will only make it easier and easier for them to be included in the research. The text size you can make bigger. You can make, I don't know why you would make it smaller, but you can make it bigger. So if you're struggling to read things, you can do that. You can't do that with a piece of paper. Hover over functionality I've mentioned a few times to explain certain words. If the participant is a bit embarrassed to ask a doctor what a certain word means, they don't need to ask the doctor. They can just ask the computer. They're not going to be embarrassed about it. And also, coming soon in REDCap, I believe there is a translation module as well, which will be able to translate it into multiple studies. Now, obviously, that will need to be validated, and there are ethical implications there. But historically, what we've done is occasionally we have provided multiple versions of patient information sheets. So what you do is you look at the most common languages, whatever, I don't know, Hindi and Polish or whatever the most common non-English Urdu and most common non-English spoken languages are, and you'll pay for a translation of that participant information sheet, and some sites will have it, and they will use that if needs be. Well, it's not in place yet, but it's certainly not beyond the realms of the possibility that within REDCap you will literally be able to translate to any language you want. As I say, it's not validated yet, but it's on its way. So that's only going to increase inclusivity, I think. And going back to the sort of slightly ageist, old-fashioned view that old people don't like tech, this is from a Janssen trial that they were doing. And so they were doing a CTIMP, and they did a study within a trial on the use of e-consent. They did questionnaires on what patients thought, what the participants in the trial thought. And this was quite a few years ago that the actual trial happened. I think it was 2016. So at that point, of the patients who are 60 years old or 60 or over, only about 1 in 3, less than 1 in 3, 1 in 4, had actually ever used a tablet before. However, and you would imagine that would be significantly higher now in the last sort of six years. However, with that in mind, the older users still universally reported high satisfaction on the e-consent function. So everyone in the trial really liked the e-consent system, and even within that, older users also really liked the e-consent system, and not one person in that trial who had experience of using traditional paper forms thought that the paper forms were better. So actually, I think it's a bit of nonsense that older people don't like using things like e-consent. So having said that, you still need to think about things and always mitigate for potential issues. So I'm going to go through a load of questions now in terms of considerations you need to make when you're using e-consent. And the first of which is slightly contradictory to what I've just said. Have you paid attention to the information needs of your patient population? Is it actually appropriate to give them electronic information? Now, as I said, I don't think necessarily someone you can't stereotype certain groups and everything like that. But do you need to keep in mind that maybe some people within your general population don't want to be using e-consent? And if so, are you going to offer more traditional alternatives? So are you going to have a hybrid system where there is a possibility of having a patient information sheet that they can do and a chat with a doctor? As I said, they always have to the conversation with the investigator, but that kind of thing. Because you don't want to necessarily exclude those people from taking part in the trial, and you can run hybrid systems. Is there still the option for face-to-face communication? Is your system accessibility friendly? Other things you need to think about is how are your participants actually going to access the forms themselves? Are you going to give them tablets? Are you going to give them phones? Are they going to use their own phone? If they use their own device, is the system that you're setting up compatible with their operating system? So you're going to make sure it works in Android and Apple and Windows and Linux or whatever. I don't think they'll be using Linux, but you're gonna make sure that it works in those systems, because if you just set it up for one, you're excluding a huge group of people, and you're going to have problems there. Alternative, as well as that, you've got to think about the browser. If it's going to be accessed through a browser, is it going to be compatible in Chrome, Safari, Edge, etc.? Same reason. What are you going to do if the participants don't have access to their own devices, and they don't have internet access. As I said, what we've done in certain studies is budgeted for a certain number of devices that we will actually send out to participants, which are 5G enabled. They don't require setting up on a patient's Wi-Fi. We loan them this kit, which is 5G enabled, or alternatively, you can have a hybrid system where you use paper as well. But if you want to use e-consent, you can give them the kit to be able to do it themselves. One thing you think about is that, you know, these tablets or these phones, are they going to be locked for trial purposes only? Because what you don't want is you don't want to have to pay for 5G and then someone uses it to stream Netflix, because it's going to get expensive. What happens if they're lost or stolen? What are you going to do? So are they going to be secure enough? Are they going to be easy to replace? And how are you going to get them back at the end? If you send them out, do you need to be sending them out with boxes for return at the end as well? What are you going to do with them at the end of the trial when you've got 300 tablets? We haven't answered that one yet. So another question is it possible to verify who's completing the form? So I talked about this earlier. So how are you going to make sure that the person signing the form is them? Are you going to do an interview? Is the person already known to the investigator? Are they coming into the clinic every other week? Do you need to do some kind of ID check? Another question is, how are you actually going to deliver what form are you going to use to deliver the information? You're always going to need to give them a patient information sheet. It can be a PDF, that's fine. But are you going to do a video as well that summarizes it? Are you going to do some kind of interactive web page? If you are, that will need to go to ethics, so you need to do it early enough in advance. If it's a video, what happens if you need to update it during the trial? You bring out a new patient information sheet, you've got to update potentially that video as well. Are you going to have capacity to do that? Can you do it in-house? Or are you going to need to budget for a certain number of amendments to that? Obviously, we didn't used to think about that kind of thing when it was a patient information sheet, because you could do that yourself. But if it's a complicated video, you might need to think about updating that. About how you're going to update that. Does your e-consent system record when the information in the consent form were accessed? So not just when it was being completed, does it capture when that form was opened? Because you want to make sure that the patients actually read the information before they consent. And how is that going to be documented? Is it going to be documented in the database, or are you going to have to require the sites to record it in the patient's notes? Because it might be audited. Is it possible within your system to record what version of the information sheet the patient has read? Because it's going to get complicated, because different sites, if you're doing a multi-international trial, different countries may approve the information at a different time. Can your system that you're using deal with multiple different versions of the information sheet? And how are you going to control that? How are you going to make sure that this site or this country uses this information sheet and this one uses this information sheet? Nearly there, don't worry. Another question is it all being documented, or is all of this going into the audit trail? And Anthony will show you how to do that in REDCap next week, I'm sure. But also, if it is going into the audit trail, how are sites going to access this? Are you going to, for example, have emails that go out that confirm when patients signed, what version number, what date they signed, that go out to the site so that they can then use that as the documentation to go in the notes or in their site file? So you need to think about that as well. Very important one is your system that you're using for e-consent. Is it actually secure? Because you're going to be collecting personal data. You're going to be collecting their names, potentially their email addresses. Has that been tested? Is there a risk if you're providing devices out to patients? Is there a risk they might accidentally access someone else's records and see their consent form? Because you really don't want that, because then they're going to be seeing other people's personal data. I've covered this one already in terms of you need to make sure that the participant is going to get a copy of the final consent form which has been signed. How are you going to do that? Is emailing it to them appropriate? Do you need to have some system where you actually end up printing it and posting it to them? Finally, but this isn't all the questions you need to think about, but finally, international trials. Well, so this talk today is basically just talked about UK guidance and regulation. However, there are different rules in different territories. So you need to think, if you're doing an international trial, can you use e-consent in all the different countries? In the EU, the good news is, as I sort of mentioned, basically it's the same regulations as in the UK. However, in the US, it's slightly different. They're quite similar, but some countries don't even allow e-consent. They don't have anything in place for that, and the ethics committee in that country probably won't approve you using it. So you're going to have to think about that if you're doing trials across lots of different parts of the world. So I'm basically done. These are just 4 links, and there are more out there, but these are 4 links I really recommend you having a look at if you want to know more. So this top one is the one I talked about, the HRA MHRA document. That's really good. Please do read that, because it's better than what I just tried to explain. Probably more succinct and would have been quicker. There's some HRA guidance as well in here, which is always good to read, not specifically about e-consent, but it's about just generally designing your consent and your information. And then this final one, which is from EU CRF, which is an industry body, because obviously industry has been using e-consent potentially a little bit longer than the academic non-commercial sector. They've produced an implementation guide as well, and that's I think it's about 20 pages long. That's pretty useful as well, and it has all sorts of fancy flow charts and everything like that. So yeah, thanks for coming today. I will have a look through the questions in a minute. The other thing just to note is, before, in case I forget, there is a, I've lost my screen, where am I? There's a turn off the transcript. There is a survey. It'd be really handy for people to fill in, which I think someone is going to post shortly. Be really useful for us. Ah, there we go. Claire's just posted it into the chat. If you could fill that in, click on that before it disappears in the chat. That would be really handy. So do we have questions, Anthony and Claire and Erica? Have you managed to pick any out? Fine.
Oh yeah, we've got quite a few. How much time have we got?
Well, I'll tell you what, why don't we do, I'll stop recording.